educational outreach programs, so we have been around. Tonight marks our fourth season of Conversations in Indiana African American History and Culture, serving K through 8th grade audiences and beyond. We are honored to welcome distinguished educators, researchers, professors, historians who will share their work and deepen our understanding of those who came before us. We invite you to join us each month for our conversation series, same time, same place, so I'll be looking forward to seeing you again, okay? And also visit the freetownvillage.org to explore our full series of programs, events, and our 7-week summer day camp, now enrolling, where youth will engage in history, culture, teamwork, and enrichment experiences that build both knowledge and character. It's a great camp. Parents love the camp, and so spread the word that we are now enrolling for that camp. I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors for their support. Our title sponsor, and really a sponsor that has been so closely aligned with our mission, and we are aligned with their mission, and that is the Black Heritage Preservation Program at Indiana Landmarks, the very place that you're in. Our other sponsors are Indiana Humanities, the Indianapolis Foundation, the Allen Whitehill Clues Foundation, the Indy Arts Council, the Indiana Arts Commission, and the IU Africa Studies. If you value this work and these conversations, we invite your support. Individual giving is just as important as foundation giving. So please consider making a contribution at freetownvillage.org as we work to reach our next 1 million participants. So tonight, it is my honor to introduce our esteemed presenters, Eunice Trotter and Jeff Stroebel. Eunice Trotter holds an AS in journalism from Indiana University Southeast, a BS in journalism, and an MBA from Webster International University. She made history as the first African-American woman to serve as an editor for the Indianapolis Star, the state's largest daily newspaper. In 1987, she purchased the Indianapolis Recorder and served as an editor-in-chief and publisher until 1991. Her journalism career also includes work with the Stockton Record and the New York Post, as well as leadership roles such as Zones Editor at Florida Today, Associate Editor at the News Sentinel, and Courts Editor at the Palm Beach Post. In 2005, Eunice founded Mary Bateman Clark Enterprises, focusing on integrating African American history in Indiana into the broader American narrative. Through her research, she accomplished what many only aspire to do, and that is publishing the book Black in Indiana, based on her ancestor, Mary Bateman Clark. Her book is available, I believe, purchased tonight, maybe in this room, but definitely on Amazon. Eunice now serves as director of the Indiana Landmarks Black Heritage Preservation Program. This initiative works to identify and preserve Black heritage sites, expands recognition through the National Register of Historical Places, and build sustainable futures through funding and strong community partnerships. Thank you so much, Eunice, for your contribution to this community. Our next presenter is also Jeff Stroebel, is an Indianapolis resident who enjoys researching and writing about local history. Among his work is the story of the founding of Indianapolis' second AME church, Allen Chapel. A retired history teacher and school administrator, he taught most recently at Sycamore School. He now serves as a member of that school's Board of Trustees, as well as being on the board of the Mass Ave Cultural Arts District. A graduate of Butler University, Jeff was a recipient of the Indiana Association for the Gifted Teacher of the Year in 2001. He is also recipient of the National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship and also the Lilly Endowment Teacher Creativity Fellowship. His lifetime contribution to education was honored with the Washington Association of Educators of the Gifted and Talented Distinguished Leadership Award in 2019. Thank you, Jeff, for your contributions to education. We really appreciate that. So, following the presentation, we will take some questions from our in-person audience. And for those joining online, please share your questions in the chat and we'll respond as time allows. So lastly, to help us continue offering high-quality programs, we encourage you to complete a short evaluation. The in-person guests may scan the QR code that will be on the screen, and the online participants will receive a link. It's really important that you do fill out these evaluations. This feedback helps us measure our impact and also helps us secure future funding for programs. So, before our speakers begin, we will share a short video from our Black History Moments series, produced by Freetown Village, and additional videos researched by our own Eunice Trotter are available on our YouTube page. So, following the video, we will hear from our speakers. Thank you.
This is a little-known Black History Moment brought to you by Freetown Village.
It was the pressure of a group of local Black leaders threatening to file a lawsuit that helped in segregation of what would become Shortridge High School. Abram C. Shortridge, superintendent of Indianapolis Public Schools, convinced the Black leaders to first try integrating the Indianapolis High School by sending some of the brightest African-American children to enroll. Mary Alice Rand was that student. On school opening day in 1872, Shortridge accompanied Rand to enroll at the school, then located at Pennsylvania and Michigan Streets. She received a diploma 4 years later. Indianapolis High School remained integrated and graduated several other Blacks until the opening of the all-Black Crispus Attucks High School in 1927. After graduation, Mary Rand became a teacher.
For more information about Freetown Village, visit us at freetownvillage.org.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. You know, I love having these conversations, and this will, in fact, be a conversation. So get your questions ready. We hope to share with you some history most of us never knew about. We will be focusing on Garveyism here in Indiana, and we have a powerful researcher, historian, who's done a deep dive into that organization and its existence here in the state and in the country and world. So before we get into the nitty-gritty about Garveyism, I want to kind of set the tone for this period of Garveyism. It was the early 1900s. It was an era that was widely known as the Progressive Era. It was known in Black communities as the Golden Era. During the Progressive/Golden Era, this was a time that was harsh for African Americans. There were lynchings going on all over the country. The KKK was on an upswing here in Indianapolis and throughout the nation. This was the period of the Red Summers, where there was massacres, not riots, as sometimes they're called, but massacres in Tulsa, Rosewood, East St. Louis, Atlanta, Chicago, and so forth. For African Americans, this was known also as the Golden Era. This was the period of great migration of Blacks from the South to the North. This was the period when the NAACP was founded. This was the Harlem Renaissance age. This was the time when many of our Black churches throughout the city were organized in the 19-teens and 20s. It was also a period of great arts and culture here on Indiana Avenue, our beloved Indiana Avenue that no longer exists today. This was also the period when unionization was taking place. The sleeping car porters organized, farmers organized. This was indeed the golden era for African Americans. Now, some of the leading voices during this period were people like Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Ida B. Wells. This was a period when the fight for rights was being waged. Here in Indianapolis and throughout the nation, African Americans lived in segregated communities, typically here in areas around Indiana Avenue on the west side, the Martindale area on the east side, and for those of you who don't know where that area is, it's roughly between the Monon and Keystone, and it used to extend all the way south to Massachusetts and north to 30th Street. That area is now called the Martindale-Brightwood area because it has now incorporated areas east of Keystone. But these communities were all segregated, and within those communities was life. Douglas Park was open in that period as a segregated park because this was during a period when African Americans here in Indianapolis could not go to any other park except Douglas, and that was all right. There were businesses along 25th Street, funeral homes, shoe shine parlors, taxi companies, grocery stores, movie theaters, skating rinks, housing developments were being built just to the east of what is now known as Andrew J. Brown and formerly known as Martindale Avenue. Now, there were organizations also cropping up. On Indiana Avenue, there were numerous Masonic groups, civic groups. On the east side, there were also accompanying Masonic groups and community groups. This was a period of boom. Some of the folks who were involved on a national and even local level in creating some of these groups were these folks you see on the screen now. Booker T. Washington, Attorney Furness, and of course, Madam Walker. They were part of the National Business League. This was an organization that was founded to support businesses and to help them, sort of like a chamber of commerce. And there were many businesses during this period of the 1920s and so forth. Now, during this period of segregation, there arose tumultuous periods. One focused on integration, civil rights, and equality, and the other focused on pragmatic accommodation, separatism, and self-reliance. And from this organization, these two conflicting but yet complementary entities, arose a group called the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And I wanted to pause here for a minute because my own dad was a Universal Negro Improvement Association member. He was a Garveyite. So people who belonged to this organization were considered Garveyites. And we grew up in a segregated area in the Martindale neighborhood. We went to all black schools. We had all black everything. There were a few Jewish storekeepers in our community, but our school was all black. The doctors we went to, the teachers who taught us, the pastors who ministered to us, they were black. I make jokes with some of my girlfriends now that when I finally did go to an integrated school, which is when I was in middle school, I could not tell one white person from the other. Just being real, I couldn't. But what else did it do for us and my siblings included? It excluded race as a factor in our identity. My own father was biracial. His mother, we say, was mostly white. but you know, we never felt inferior, or you know, we never had our confidence slashed away because of racism that I found so many of my peers who did not have that upbringing experience. And so it was just fitting that my dad would have been Garveyite. He was a conscientious objector from the military. And he was an electrician, he was an entrepreneur. He never worked for anyone. He felt that people should make their own work and make their own money without being reliant upon anyone, such as an employer, to hire and pay them. And we had many examples in our neighborhoods. We had the milkman and the watermelon man and the ice man and the car man and the cab man and all these different people who we call today entrepreneurs. So I'm going to have my partner come up to go deeper into what it meant to be Garveyite, who that organization was, what its principles were and are today. And come on up, Jeff. You take it away here.
Great. Well, thank you for being here. I'd like to just take a moment and explain how I got here. My name, again, is Jeff Stroebel, and you heard a little bit about my background as an educator, but I had done some small research projects for Eunice, and back last fall, she gave me a call and said, I really would like to make Garveyism and Garveyites the highlight of this upcoming 2026 Juneteenth celebration, and I'd like you to do some research in this area. I have to confess that I could have probably filled half a sheet of paper with what I knew about the UNIA and Marcus Garvey at that point. So this has been a journey for me over the last 6 months. My wife's in the audience, and she could probably attest that I feel like I've lived with Mr. Garvey for the last 6 months. And my biggest challenge tonight, honestly, is that there's so much that I would love to tell you about this movement and Marcus Garvey, and the 8 hours we have left tonight is not enough to fill that. Yeah, that's a joke. But I will try to move very quickly, and I hope there's something in the presentation that I have or that Eunice had that will stimulate a question so that we can go deeper, because I really don't have the luxury of going deep into any of these topics tonight. But Garvey was born in Jamaica, and his Caribbean background, he was born in 1887. His Caribbean background was very, very important to him. He was born under relatively humble circumstances, but he was obviously a very, very bright child, and he was in love with words, the written word, the spoken word, and also printing. So he had the opportunity at a young age as a teenager to be apprenticed to a printer. And this was a skill that he utilized the rest of his life. And in his early 20s, he decided that he wanted to travel throughout the Caribbean, South and Central America. And during those journeys, he became deeply aware of the conditions in which Black people lived and worked in that area. And after traveling through the Caribbean for several years and supporting himself in a variety of jobs, he had a unique ability to get himself fired from jobs, because with his education, he had an opportunity to be in a management position. One of his jobs was he was a timekeeper for the United Fruit Company on a fruit plantation. But when he was always trying to organize the workers to better their conditions, and whenever there were strikes, he always sided with the workers, and that's not something management's supposed to do, so he frequently was dismissed. But he decided after this journey that he would go to London. London at this point before the First World War was kind of the melting pot of a lot of different cultures, and he really felt that there would be opportunities there for him that were not here in the Western Hemisphere. And he quickly discovered that for a person of his dark complexion, the opportunities there were not any greater. And he came to a realization, and later in his words, that he said that it is because you are Black. It is not because of your education, the way you speak, your experiences. The way that you are treated is because of the fact that you are Black. And this was a key part of establishing his philosophy of race first, because he really looked at this not as a class problem, not as an education problem, but as a racial problem. So He came up with the ambitious idea in 1916 when he formed the UNIA that he wanted to unite the entire world's 400 million, as he would have said, Negroes, to better their conditions. Now, that's a goal. That's an ambitious goal. And one of the key things to remember about Garveyism is that it was an international movement. There are kind of three pillars to the philosophy of Garveyism. The first is racial pride. As Martin Luther King said on the first slide that we had, Garvey not only organized the first mass movement of Negroes in the United States, but he was also the person that first told African Americans that they were somebody. And when you think of the conditions, Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, virtually everything else in society was geared to the opposite message, that you are not somebody, you are not equal. So simply Garvey's message of racial pride was revolutionary. But he just didn't tell people that they were somebody. I think the key to Garveyism is that he institutionalized this sense of racial pride, which is why I chose this picture in the slide of a UNIA member who was part of the African Legion, which was one of the many organizations that the UNIA had. And when you look at this man, remember this picture was taken in 1924, so we're not too far away from the First World War. He is in a crisp military uniform, and you can see the amount of pride. And by having these uniforms and by having these social organizations, such as the Black Cross Nurses for women, this created a sense of pride and a reason to be proud of your race. The UNIA was big on ceremony, parades, rituals, things like that, that all reinforced the social nature of the organization and gave people a sense of belonging to something that was greater than themselves and really outstanding and centered on being Black. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar, and this is what Garvey is most known for. If you know anything about Garvey, but just a little bit, it's this: he was an advocate of going back to Africa. And like everything with Garvey, it's a little bit more complex than that, because he never really advocated that every Black person in the United States should go back to Africa. That was definitely not the dream. The idea is really well illustrated in these two quotes in front of you, because the idea of going back to Africa was to create a strong, powerful, Black-led country. And it was his belief that this was the most effective way of building racial pride. Garveyites and the NAACP looked, as Eunice introduced you to this challenges of race in very, very different terms. And they were very critical of each other. Some of this was personal, but a lot of it was philosophical. And the second quote up there really illustrates this, that the NAACP sought legal and governmental means of ending the abuses of segregation. And Garvey said, that will not work. Garvey said, when you are sending another petition up to Congress, I'm going to show up as a representative of a powerful country, and I will be treated with respect because of that position. You often see pictures of Garvey in kind of a military or a very prominent outfit, and this again was all about this institutionalization of racial pride that he believed in. There were two predominantly Black countries in Africa at the time. There was Liberia, which had been founded by American expats in the 1820s, so he was not the first person to think about going back to Africa. And there was also Ethiopia, which held a particular position of pride in the Black community, because Ethiopia was the only country in Africa that had successfully resisted European colonization. In fact, in 1896, the Ethiopians had dealt a rather dramatic defeat to the Italian armies and expelled them from Ethiopia, or as it would have been known at the time by some, Abyssinia. So there were two already Black-led African countries, but Garvey really didn't have a great deal of respect for the African culture at the time, and he did not feel like these were countries on the status of a Britain or France, and that's what he wanted to build. He wanted to build a great nation in Africa that would command the respect of the rest of the world. The second pillar, or the third pillar that's important to understand, is this idea of economic development. He believed that you couldn't force yourself into areas where you were not wanted, and the way that you would better your community was by developing your own businesses. Now, Garvey, when he came to the United States in 1916, he began to tour the country. He began to give speeches. He was a great speaker, and his movement took off like a rocket. And he established himself in Harlem, and that's where the UNIA was based. And in Harlem, there were a number of UNIA-run businesses. There were 2 restaurants, 4 groceries, a laundry, a doll factory that made black dolls. So the idea of developing your own industries is something the UNIA lived out, especially in New York City. In most cities, the way this manifested itself was simply supporting and building existing black businesses. You know, that the black community should shop at groceries that are run by black proprietors and so forth. But he really emphasized this idea of building an economic community and supporting that community. And the way that this was financed was rather ingenious. He sold, wrong direction. He sold stock. And you could buy stock for as little as $1. In many cases, stock certificates were sold for $5. And this was also a source of pride, because people who had no other contact with these businesses were very proud to own certificates of stock. Garvey's greatest business idea was the idea of creating a great shipping line. He was also a master fundraiser. The medals there were medals that were given out to people for supporting the various initiatives of the UNIA, and in their newspaper they published the names of contributors, so we know some of the people in the Indianapolis community that contributed to the UNIA and so forth. But his grandest plan, and again, this all goes back to the idea of building pride and respect, his grandest plan was to create a merchant shipping line. And he was a great admirer. He'd grown up in Jamaica, so he'd grown up under a British system. He was very much an admirer of the British Navy and the Merchant Marine and the Cunard Line, which was known as the White Star Line. So he wanted to create a Black Star Line. And part of the idea of the Black Star Line was that it would provide transportation for people who wanted to go back to Africa. But it was much broader than that. First of all, ships were Jim Crow too at this time. So African Americans who wanted to travel on transatlantic ships were subject to all the degradations of being treated, lower than a third class passenger, despite whatever their economic circumstances were. So one would have been to transport people to Africa, one would have been to provide transportation for other purposes to Europe and so forth for African American travelers, but also the idea was that this would stimulate trade, that it would stimulate trade between black businesses in the Caribbean, black businesses in Africa, black businesses in the United States. And for reasons we'll get into in a little bit, this was his great downfall. I think the real challenge is that starting an international shipping line is quite the endeavor. He did not really have any experience in this. He did not want to bring in whites to run the country or run the company, and there was just a very limited number of blacks in the world that had sufficient experience to do this. And ships were purchased, stock was sold, ships were purchased, captain, a man by the name of Cochran, was hired, but it turned into be somewhat of a fiasco. The ships that were purchased were not in good shape. There were kickbacks that were delivered in the purchasing, so the price of the ships was greatly inflated. There was a general kind of down beat in the shipping economy after World War I as well. They didn't really understand liability contracts. So this really was a bridge too far for Garvey and the UNIA and would lead to future problems. But this was launched with great fanfare in about 1919. Excuse me. And so this period from when Garvey comes to the United States in 1916, establishes himself in Harlem in 1917, and then we get to 1920, the movement took off like a rocket. And this is kind of the keynote event, really announcing the UNIA as a major presence. They held a convention that ran a month. Many of the sessions were in Madison Square Garden in New York City. It was preceded by a huge parade that attracted thousands of people as onlookers. 25,000 people attended from 25 different countries. So this kind of shows you the broad appeal that Garvey's ideas had in society. A key to making this an international movement was the publication of the UNIA newspaper called the Negro World. And this circulated throughout the world. Many African countries controlled by colonial powers like Britain, France, and Portugal banned the importation, but black sailors would smuggle it in to these areas. And this shows you not only the international reach of the Negro World on the right side, but every week in the Negro World, there would be reports from the various divisions. And unfortunately, like many topics in Black history, there's not a lot that has survived or has been written about the UNIA. When I took on this project, I was really surprised that there was absolutely no secondary research on the UNIA in Indiana. So our best source of information about the UNIA in Indiana and in our cities comes from the reports in the Negro World. And you can see, a variety of reports that came from Indianapolis, and a lot of it had to do with what was going on in the UNIA, but a lot of it also had to do with what else was happening in the Black community, like the announcement of the candidacy of Henry Richardson, who was the first person elected to the state legislature. So this was the glue that held the movement together. Women played a prominent role in the UNIA. In fact, I would challenge you to find any organization in the 1920s in which women played close to an equal role more than the UNIA. Every UNIA division, which is what they called their local chapters, had a male president and also a lady president. At every UNA meeting, there were speakers, male speakers, but almost always female speakers. Even the national organization leadership, women were represented in the committee structure and so forth. Garvey's second wife, Amy Jakes, kept the movement alive after he went to prison. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. The lady in the center, Harriet Vinson Davis, was a major organizer in the organization. So women were well respected. I mentioned the Black Cross nurses before. African Americans were not allowed to serve in the Red Cross. We're not allowed to be members of the Red Cross at this point. So the Black Cross nurses was kind of equivalent to the male African legions, and they basically fulfilled a public health purpose of educating people in terms of public health, also providing direct services to communities and so forth. And I love this painting because it shows there's pride in the stance and the attire of this young woman here. Okay. People always ask about Madam Walker and Garvey, and we're talking about Garveyism in Indiana. Their paths did cross. They shared many of the same objectives. Madam Walker was interested in Africa. Madam Walker was a supporter, especially later in her life, of many causes, and Garveyism was one of them. They met in really the last year of Madam Walker's life in 1919 but Garvey went to her villa on the Hudson. She supported Garvey. She made contributions to his organization. Most importantly, she advertised in his newspaper, and that was crucial. In fact, the contributions that she gave him in 1919 are credited with really allowing him to establish the Negro World as a newspaper. She was very interested in this idea of racial unity and had formed an organization, or was part of the formation of an organization called the International League of Darker Peoples, which is very similar to the goal of Garvey's movement as well. And African redemption simply meant the settlement of Africa. You need to understand that this is all happening in 1919 in the wake of the First World War. And so Garvey's idea that there could be a strong black nation in Africa came out of the idea that there were German colonies in Africa. And it became clear when the war was over that Germany would not be allowed to retain these colonies. So Madam Walker, W.E.B. Du Bois, Garvey, they were all part of a movement to go to the peace negotiations that followed World War I and to demand that these former German colonies be turned over to black rule. Now, the European powers were not interested in that, but it was a plausible way of achieving this idea of black-run countries in Africa. Actually, the U.S. State Department prevented Madam Walker from obtaining a passport to go to Paris to be part of this process. Garveyism was represented in 8 Indianapolis cities at various times. This is between 1919 would be the first, up through the 1930s. You can see it's not just Indiana, or not just Indianapolis. In fact, the division in Gary may well have been larger than the one in Indianapolis. For a while, Indianapolis had 2 divisions, but you can see that most major Indianapolis cities had Garveyite divisions in them, and there was a structure to the Garveyite meetings that kind of everybody followed. They would start off by singing the song From Greenland's Icy Mountains. There would be prayers. There would be a reading of Garvey's words from the Negro World, because the first page of the Negro World was always the thoughts of Marcus Garvey. There would be speeches, and then they would usually conclude with singing the anthem, Ethiopia, thou land of our fathers. So these meetings were usually about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Sundays. You'd go to church, get something to eat, and you would go to the UNIA meeting here. So Garvey visited Indiana, we know 5 times, and it's very likely that there was a 6th, but the first time that he visited Indiana, he wouldn't have been a well-known figure, so we're not absolutely sure. He appears on an itinerary. This was early in his time in the U.S., and he visited 38 states. It's unlikely that Indiana would not have been included in one of them. But the biggest times that he came were in 1921 and 1922. He was here for several days. He spoke at various centers in the black community, which were usually churches. He also visited Gary. And then the last time that he came to Indianapolis, he spoke at Bethel AME, which is the church on the canal, and attracted close to 1,000 people to hear him speak. So he was here. The first chapter in Indianapolis was formed in 1919. Lafayette Buchanan is one of the people who is cited as a founder of the Indianapolis chapter. Mr. Buchanan lived a very long life, as you can see from his funeral program there. He lived to be 95 years old, and he was involved in one way or another in this movement throughout his entire life. A variety of people served as presidents of the UNIA in Indianapolis. We don't know a lot about many of these people. They were not people who were viewed, with one notable exception, Thomas King, they were not people who were viewed as community leaders outside the UNIA. They were mostly working class, and there was quite a bit of turnover. Another thing that they had in common is they were people who were generally not born in Indianapolis, but had come up from the South. A lot of these people were born in Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, and so forth. And it's likely that this list is not complete simply because we don't have all the records. However, there were important people in Indianapolis, and I'm going to ask Eunice to come back up and just talk a little bit about some of the people who supported or participated in the Garveyite movement.
And I just want you to know that that person on the last screen, Thomas King, is someone many of you might be very familiar with. Thomas King was the proprietor of the King and King Funeral Home, which was located at 15th and Columbia, and was an entrepreneur. He was not only the leader of the Garveyite movement, his wife also was very active. Her name was Nettie King. We are in the process now of creating a memorial to the Kings that would include all of their work. That work is being done in conjunction with the Harrison Center. So Thomas King was definitely a leader. Also, before I forget, want to point out that on the east side of Indianapolis, the Liberty Hall, which the meeting places were called, was located in the very site of our family church, Scott United Methodist Church. That is where the Liberty Hall was located, and that is where these meetings would be held. As Jeff mentioned, after church services, people would go to the Liberty Hall, which was in a house at 21st and Martindale. There was also Liberty Hall on Boulevard Place. Boulevard Place at that time was an area where black professionals lived, and there was also a Liberty Hall that was created there. So you have the clicker. Go to the next. Then you can go ahead and click for, look, click for me. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about some of these folks here who were very important members or officers or supporters of UNIA, starting with F.B. Ransom. You all might know that he was a lawyer for Madam Walker. Dr. Benjamin Osborne, I got to meet him personally. He was the Center Township trustee for years. He preceded Julia Carson as Center Township trustee, so he was there for years. And one of my favorite people who used to send boxes of oranges to me at one point was Henry J. Richardson. As Jeff pointed out, he was elected to the House, the Indiana House of Representatives, and was a wonderful man. He and his wife were very active in various organizations here in Indianapolis. Marjorie Joyner was vice president of Madam Walker's company, and she was a very active member, high visibility in UNIA. Now, Jeff is going to come and talk to you more and deeper about Dr. Maloney and J.D. Barber. They're fascinating people.
Yes, this has really been the most fun part of my research, is discovering some of these people who you should know, but my guess is you don't know. And there were two people in Indianapolis in the kind of the heyday of the Garveyite movement of the 1920s that achieved national prominence in the organization. The first is Arnold Hamilton Maloney, and Maloney was also from the Indies. He was born in Trinidad in 1888, so he was a similar age to Garvey. He came to the United States in 1910 to train as a priest, and he was trained as an Episcopal priest. He is at the top right of the picture there. He was assigned to Indianapolis in 1916 to St. Philip's Episcopal Church, which was an integrated church on Northwest Street at 702 Northwest Street. He was the only African American leader of a church in the Episcopal faith in the state of Indiana, and he was also the youngest. He was a man whose mind was never satisfied kind of being still. The accomplishments that he had in the period of about 15 years almost sound false because they are so incredible. He was a writer. He contributed to a number of journals and publications. He was involved in the founding of the Senate Street YMCA, where he would have known Madam Walker, would have known the figures that Eunice talked about. He was the vice president of the NAACP in Indianapolis, and he became involved in the Garveyite movement in about 1920. He traveled to New York City. He spoke at the conventions that the UNIA had every year. Garvey appointed him the chaplain general of the movement, which gave him great prominence because he opened every session at the convention and closed every session at the convention. He became a college professor. He took an offer in the early 1920s to be a professor of psychology at Wilberforce University in Ohio, and he was there for several years. And then he decided, well, I'm kind of bored with this. I think I want a medical degree. So he came back to Indiana and graduated from the IU School of Medicine in 1929. He then set his sights on earning a PhD, which he did 2 years later in pharmacology at the University of Wisconsin. And even though he remained connected with Indianapolis through his wife's family and visited often, after he graduated with his PhD, he went to Howard University, where he was the head of the pharmacology department until he retired in the early 1950s. And he discovered an antidote for barbiturate overdoses, which was a significant challenge, not only for people, but for animals. So he was an incredibly noted man of many, many different accomplishments, and most people have never heard of him. His son is in the picture at the bottom here. His son was also followed in his father's footsteps in terms of education. He was a Crispus Attucks graduate, married a fellow Crispus Attucks student, and went to IU Med School, was trained as a surgeon, and was assigned as a flight surgeon to the Tuskegee Airmen. So he had that notable point of history. And then after the war, Arnold Jr. and his wife went to Monrovia and to practice medicine in Liberia. Unfortunately, my following of his trail after that has kind of come to a dead end, but he really lived what his father believed in and went back to Africa to serve in Liberia. The second man is kind of completely different because Maloney represents an element of the UNIA that often didn't get credited. The UNIA was sometimes viewed as a lower class movement. In fact, some of the members of the NAACP kind of looked down their nose at the UNIA and Garveyism and all the pomp and circumstance of and ritual of the Garveyite movement. Obviously, Maloney was absolutely the top of achievement. The second person I'd like to talk to you about, though, comes from a working class background. J.D. Barber was born in Kentucky. He served as a private in the Spanish-American War, and he came to Indianapolis in about 1900. He worked a number of working class jobs. He was a delivery man, he was a messenger, he was a porter, but he became involved in a church, which was an offshoot of the AME church, a more evangelical Pentecostal form of the AME church that was called Triumph the Church. And it was founded by a Reverend E.D. Smith, and Barber was someone that Smith depended on, and he rose swiftly in the church. And Smith's dream was to go to Ethiopia to preach the gospel. So in 1919, Smith and Barber left for Ethiopia. They were greeted by the ruling family of Ethiopia, the queen and the prince regent, who later became the Emperor Haile Selassie. They talked about spreading the gospel, and Smith, unfortunately, was a little more candid. He shared that his hope was that he would spread the gospel and he would become the king of Ethiopia, without much sense of how the ruling family of Ethiopia would feel about that. So Smith and Barber were invited in 1920 to a great banquet. They were awarded the Star of Ethiopia, which is one of the greatest honors that the monarchy in Ethiopia could bestow on someone. but Smith fell ill in the course of the banquet, and it's believed that he was poisoned. Barber, fortunately, did not eat the same foods as Smith did, but he beat a hasty retreat from Ethiopia and returned to the United States. However, in a movement that glorified going back to Africa, the fact that Barber had been to Africa, which very few of the UNIA supporters had ever been, Garvey himself never set foot on the continent of Africa. So the fact that this man from Indianapolis, J.D. Barber, had been to Africa, had met the Empress and Prince Regent of Ethiopia and had been awarded by them, gave him great credibility. And so he was a prominent speaker at the UNIA conventions. And in 1924, he was part of a delegation. He is a person in the upper left-hand side of the picture to deliver a petition for support to President Calvin Coolidge. So he played an important role as well. Eunice talked about Thomas King. King was probably the most effective local leader of the UNIA. It was King who brought the two branches, the east side and the west side of the UNIA in Indianapolis together, at least temporarily in 1929. And he was a bit of an outlier in terms of he had a prominent position in the community before he was a president of the UNIA. And she mentioned Nettie King, Thomas's wife. This was very typical in the UNIA that leaders and their wives worked together. It was quite natural for the male president's wife to be the secretary of the local division, or even the lady president of the local division. As I said before, Gary was probably the other large base of UNIA support. Gary was kind of a new town in the wake of the First World War, and there was a lot of tension. It was based, of course, on the steel industry, and there was discrimination in terms of what jobs blacks could be hired for in Gary. So a race-based advocacy organization was very popular there. Their numbers, as I said, were probably larger in most cases than they were in Indianapolis. Charles James was a man who was involved in the movement for a very, very long time. He was a steel worker, and he was president of the division in Gary starting in 1929, and he was involved in one form or another up through the 1970s, and he was part of the executive committee on the national level. So he was a significant person, not just in Indiana, but on the national level. So what happened to this movement? Why is it that we don't remember, the Garveyites as much as probably their prominence in the 1920s would warrant? Couple things. First of all, there was opposition to the Garveyite movement from the other civil rights organizations, NAACP, W.E.B. Du Bois especially. Some of this was based on philosophy, kind of integrationist versus separate development. Some of it was based on personality. Du Bois was a Harvard-educated PhD, who Garvey probably would have said was snooty and elitist, and yet Du Bois looked at Garvey as somewhat of uneducated, and all of the pomp and the uniforms and things as somewhat buffoonish. So there was tension there, and it was a view of the NAACP leadership at this time, as Garvey became more prominent, that he was actually harmful to the cause of African Americans. They were prominent in publicizing the charges of corruption with the Black Star Line. There was a movement that was Garvey must go. The Chicago Defender, which was one of the leading African American papers in the Midwest, the publisher of the Chicago Defender, was a harsh critic of Garvey as well. And Garvey was convicted and jailed for mail fraud. I'm not going to go into the details in the Q&A or afterwards. You can talk about this. It was a miscarriage of justice, but not necessarily in the way that we usually think of racial miscarriages of justice in the 1920s. In fact, one of the interesting things is that Garvey challenged the neutrality of the judge, not because he was a segregationist, but because he was a white member of the NAACP, and Garvey felt that that would be prejudicial. The biggest mistake, like many great men, Garvey had enormous faith in himself, an enormous conviction in his mission, but that produced some blind spots, and Garvey fired his attorney and chose to defend himself, which possibly with better legal defense, he would not have been convicted. The charges were somewhat flimsy. The charges were that there was fraud because they had sold stock in the Black Star shipping line and sold stock for a ship that technically they had not purchased yet. So it was a kind of a technical charge. They sent out 35,000 questionnaires to people who had bought stock in the Black Star line, hoping that they would get dirt on Garvey, and they got like 7 responses out of 35,000 of these questionnaires. The man who led the charge against Garvey was a young attorney from the Bureau of Investigation that you may recognize his name. He was J. Edgar Hoover. And Hoover resented, any movement of organizing black people. And as early as 1919, he was kind of on a crusade to get Garvey. So Garvey went to jail. He was convicted. He was sentenced to 5 years in jail. He only served a little over 2. He was paroled, but part of the condition of his release was he was deported. And that, even though the movement continued, that delivered a blow. He never returned to the United States after 1927. So the UNA became less centralized, but it didn't die because of the strength of the social organizations the local divisions had built. And as time went on, the Great Depression, there were just other things that came up that lessened Garveyism. But Garveyism continued. It just didn't continue under the name of Garveyism in the UNIA. There were movements like the Peace Movement of Ethiopia in Chicago that had many of the same beliefs. In Indianapolis, there were progressive leagues and progressive civic leagues that some of the leaders, like Lafayette Buchanan, who'd been leaders in the UNIA, they continued. And this went well into the 1960s. So the high point of Garveyism in the 1920s and the early 1930s may have ended, but his ideas and the social structures that he built did preserve. The lasting impact is amazing. I said I started this journey of research in October, and I recall watching the Super Bowl, and in the pregame festivities, Coco Jones came out to sing Lift Every Voice and Sing, and I noticed she's in this beautiful white outfit, but has black, red, and green piping across her shoulders and at the bottom. And those are the colors of Garveyism. Garveyism believed that his movement and his people needed a flag like every other great nation had, and his flag was red, black, and green. And you will see at least 2 of those colors reflected in many of the flags of the African countries today. Garvey was an inspiration to many people. He was an inspiration to the civil rights leaders of the 1960s. Malcolm X said, everything that you see now in this movement, it all goes back to Garvey. He was an inspiration to the nationalist movements in Africa. Ghana is a great example, but Kenya as well. And as we started this presentation, I'll kind of bring it to its end. Dr. King credited Garvey in his work as the first great African-American leader in the United States. Justice is slow, but it does occur sometimes. Back in the days when you didn't have to pay for your pardons. But President Joe Biden, in one of his last acts, pardoned Garvey. Now, President Coolidge had released him, but he didn't pardon him and did not wipe out the charges. And so Joe Biden, I miss that guy, but Joe Biden, one of his last acts was to pardon Garvey, and this had been like a 40-year quest by African-American representatives in Congress to have justice due to Marcus Garvey. So I think, you can see why Eunice was interested in telling this story and why it'll be part of our Juneteenth festivities, which we hope that you will join us. And I realize we dumped a lot of information on you, but I hope we have time for a few questions along the way. If we, yeah, Eunice.
So I hope you got a lot out of this. I wanted to point out just a couple things, and these are things black folks can say that white folks can't say. I'll say it. One of the huge schisms between the integrationist factor and the Garvey factor, the separatist factor, was colorism. And it's an issue that still rears its ugly head today. W.E.B. Du Bois being very fair-skinned, Garvey being very dark-skinned. Jeff shared an article with me just a few days ago that he had uncovered. What was that source?
It was published in The Crisis, which was the NAACP.
Yeah, and that's another thing. You know that the NAACP was founded by mostly white people, too. And so there was that schism of colorism. So I just want you to know that that was a factor in just throughout the history of Garveyism with people who were involved in it. But fast forward to June 19th at 6 p.m., my hope for presenting this history during that event is that it will have an impact on mindsets. We are in a period now where Garveyism is sorely needed. People need to be entrepreneurial. One of the favorite quotes that I'd like to share with you of Garvey is, "We want to be the boss of ourselves." And so with that, I'm going to bring you on back up. We're going to answer some questions. I don't know if there's a microphone in the audience anywhere. Do you have one back here?
Gentleman here has a question.
Okay.
Shortly past Rockville Road, there's a house that used to be owned by Thomas Jackson, who was a member of the Garveyites for many years, and he used to print the picture for the members in the Cincinnati branch for a number of years. And I went with him 3 times to Cincinnati to the UNI meetings.
Good, great, thank you.
He's a name I've come across in the research.
Yeah.
Thomas Johnson?
No,
Jackson.
Thomas Jackson.
Okay.
There's a question here.
You know, during the early part of the 19th century, there were groups that were in Indianapolis and in Indiana who were looking for membership, who were looking for people to become dues-paying members. The Klan was one of those groups. Why are we so down on the Klan and other groups that were doing the same thing that you're promoting here tonight as the Garveyites, or for them having their own separatism? Don't you think that certain white people deserve to have the same privilege to segregate themselves and to not be imposed on by people that they don't want anything to do with? I mean, it's as if we're talking tonight about black people were so poor and pitiful that they have to force themselves on white people to be accepted at gunpoint. So I'm just concerned that what the information you're giving tonight, especially about Africa and especially Liberia, when the blacks went back to Liberia armed with guns and even intensified more under President Buchanan and President Johnson after the Civil War, they were sent over there as armed people, and what they done is they went to the interior of Africa and started to capture slaves and sell them to the Arabs. They sold them for 15 pounds sterling a head, and that was set up by the United States government to get around the importation of slaves. And I even suggest even suggest that the Garveyites and so forth, which was operating from a bunch of dry dock ships, was to actually undercut and bring more slaves from Africa into the United States under the guise of Liberia, because they had weapons to use against the.
You make good points. Do you want to talk about the Klan and Garvey? Or
Sure.
Okay.
All
right.
I think the simple answer to your first question is no. I don't necessarily believe that, but 90% of what you just said is very true to what Garvey would have said. You know, exactly. I mean, you could have spoken at one of the Garveyite meetings. His relationship with the Klan was one of the things that led to his downfall and one of the reasons for the rivalry with the NAACP, because as the gentleman said, that was pretty much Garvey's view as well. He believed in the racial purity of black people, and he did not begrudge the Klan for their belief in racial purity of white people. He met with the Klan leaders. I believe it's 1922, but he met with the leaders of the Klan, and his basic message was, you know, my movement is not a threat to you. He too was against intermarriage, which was one of the big, you know, push points of the Klan, and he felt like if he could establish common ground with the Klan, he could bring an end to some of the violence. Certainly not all. You know, all of the lynching that was so prevalent in the United States at the time, especially in the southern states, was organized by the Klan. Unfortunately, a lot of it was organized by just ordinary people in communities. But he did have some common beliefs with the Klan in terms of the separateness of the races and the separate development. And you probably saw some of that in the quotes that were up there. You know, he made statements about not begrudging white businesses for not hiring African Americans, because he said, well, people take care of their own, and you know, that's just the way it is, and we need to take care of our own. So it is a complicated relationship, but honestly, 90% of what you said is Garveyism and reflects the views of the movement.
I'd like to know more about the recruitment efforts, how people were recruited to Garveyism, in particular, Eunice, to your father's recruitment, and also was the component you mentioned about being a conscientious objector, was that part of Garveyism?
Well, for my dad, you know, we lived in a neighborhood of Garvey division, so I don't know all the details about how he personally was recruited to have those beliefs or to even to have memberships in UNIA divisions. I do know that it was a movement that taught self-reliance, that taught pride, racial pride, that taught entrepreneurship, those kinds of principles that were really quite attractive at that time. There were many conscientious objectors during that period, because many African American men felt they did not want to go to a war to return home only to be subjected to the level of racism that they were subjected to. So whether it had to do with Garveyism or his way of thinking about putting his own life at risk for a country that may or may not have even wanted him to be here, I can't say. But, you know, I do know that it was not uncommon, you know, during that period.
I mean, I think the recruiting power was part of the ideals, but I think it was also part of the social organization. You know, this was a period of great change. A lot of the African American community had migrated from the South in the last 10 to 20 years. So people were looking for a sense of community, and I think that was one of the brilliant parts of the Garveyite movement. As I said, they institutionalized this idea of racial pride, but there was a sense of community here. Similar, I mean, a lot of the rituals, even though the UNIA was not religious in nature, a lot of the rituals did parallel that of the black church and provided, you know, kind of the same need of a sense of community and connection. So I think that was, you know, part of the appeal. But if you understand the times that people were living in, you know, you can see the message of racial pride, self-reliance, Pride in Africa, you can see that that would appeal to many, many people. And it was a multi-class, it was a movement that was really open to everyone in the African American community, regardless of skin tone, regardless of position and so forth. Although some of the leaders of African American society had reservations and shied away from being too prominently identified with the Garveyite movement. But it was something that I think it's easy to understand the attraction that people had for it.
So we have a question from online. This guy says, is there much coverage of the local Garveyite movement in the Recorder?
I'll answer. There was quite a bit of coverage of the Garveyite movement in the Indianapolis Recorder. I found just many articles about events, meeting notices, speakers coming in to town. Actually, in newspapers around the state, I found coverage of Garvey movement activity. Interestingly, there was one article, I think I told you about this one, Jeff, in the Fort Wayne newspaper where there was an ice cream parlor operated by the UNIA in Fort Wayne. And when a speaker, and it doesn't say Garvey was the speaker, but when a speaker went to Fort Wayne to speak, a mini riot occurred. The black community in Fort Wayne objected to the presence of UNIA members there in Fort Wayne. And the newspaper article coverage did not give a conclusion of what had happened, and I don't know if you found anything that concluded that either, but there was a confrontation between groups of African Americans over whether or not Garveyism would be a practice embraced in Fort Wayne.
The Garvey movement, because it was such a big part of the community, was pretty well covered in most of the black newspapers of the time. As I mentioned, like with the Chicago Defender, it wasn't always sympathetic coverage, but there was coverage. Maloney, one of the people that I shared some information about, he had a column in the Indianapolis Recorder. It was called Maloney's Mind, and kind of like what's on my mind, Maloney's Mind, and also later in the national newspaper, he had a Negro from Indianapolis. So the black newspapers did cover the UNIA, and they're an important source. Unfortunately, we don't have archives of the recorders from the earliest years in Indianapolis, which is why the research from like 1919 to 1922 is pretty sketchy. By far the best resource, and it's all online, but the Negro World, the copies of the Negro World are pretty much complete and available online, and it's fascinating reading. I mean, just even look at the products that are advertised and, the news from all around the world. I mean, you could pick up a Negro World and you could read about Sandinistas in Nicaragua, you could read about Gandhi in India, and you could read about the meeting that was held at 16th and Senate in Indianapolis. So the Negro World is definitely the best source of information. There's also a number of published biographies of Garvey. I think the best and most approachable one is called Negro with a Hat by a West Indian man, Colin Grant. And it reads a bit like a novel, so if you wanted to learn more about Garvey himself, I think that would be a good starting point. Colin Grant's Negro with a Hat.
Malone, I don't need the mic.
Okay, wait a minute.
We're recording, so please go ahead.
Okay, you mentioned Maloney. And I'm just curious, you said his wife's family is from Indianapolis. What was her last name?
I'll check my notes, but it's either
Okay.
Johnson or Johnston. Her first name was Beatrice.
I'm
Beatrice.
Beatrice, okay.
They lived on the west side, and that was one of the reasons, because, I mean, this guy was doing so much stuff over a short period of time, and he traveled a lot, but even after he went to Washington, D.C., they did return because of his wife's family. They lived close to Indiana Avenue on the west side.
And the second question is, are the slides available somewhere?
I'll leave that up to Indiana Landmarks, but yeah, we certainly want to spread the word about this topic and can find a way to do that.
During the time of Garvey, there was also domestic movements to the West for self-reliance. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of this was a response to the fact that post-Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws became prevalent and it became impossible to compete on an equal footing. And that was a lot of what Garvey was trying to create, was equal footing. It was not so much, and Larry may want to respond, but then every time they tried, like going out to Oklahoma, President Harrison pulled the rug out underneath all the people that had invested huge amounts of money to go out to the land rush in 1890. So is there a thread between Garveyism and this domestic movement as well?
I think it's just that Garvey had what we might call cynical and we might call realistic view of the white community toward blacks. And you had all these things, such as you mentioned, the massacres that occurred in the wake of the First World War. And his message was basically, yeah, this is the way it is, and we need to be strong. We need to gain the respect. We need to be strong. Don't look for somebody else to liberate you. You must, liberate yourself. As far as the Western movement, I don't know, but Garveyism was particularly strong in California. Oakland, which is probably not a surprise, Oakland and LA were strong Garveyite movements, and there's been a published research study of the Garveyites in Los Angeles that interviewed people who had been involved in the movement. Wish somebody would have done that in Indiana, but that's really, really fascinating. And one of the things that I took from that research is one of the veterans who had been there during the 1920s said, never once did anybody tell me I needed to go back to Africa, because that's one of the most prevalent myths, that the pitch was everyone should go back to Africa. That was super interesting. I could also mention, it's a little bit hard to find online, but PBS Frontline did a wonderful hour documentary. It's about 20 years old, about Garvey and the UNIA, and it really starts with the 1920 convention. It's worth a watch too if you're interested in this subject. We've exhausted.
Good. I just want to thank you all for being here. Thank you, Jeff. Jeff has emerged as probably the #1 historian as it relates to Indiana Garveyism with the work that he's done. We have found no other research source of information with the volume of information that Jeff has been able to amass. So for that, I thank you, Jeff, very much. So thank you. And thank you all for being here. Been a great audience. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Freetown Village.
Oh my goodness, this was just a fascinating discussion. I so much that I just learned in this session that you don't find in little quips on the news or anything like that. I mean, you have to be involved. You have to do the research. You have to do the reading, and these are the kind of conversations that are happening in the conversation series. So we would invite you all to please continue to come back, bring friends, and spread the word about the conversation series. Also, we would like I have some good housekeeping notes here, and that is that we invite you to support the Freetown Village by going to freetownvillage.org for your contributions. There should be a QR code at some point. Nope, okay. But there will be a QR code for the evaluations. Is that correct? Okay, so again, if you would take a moment, scan the QR code, and please evaluate this conversation. We would really appreciate it. And just thank you, Eunice and Jeff, and thank you to the audience for your great questions, and have a wonderful evening.